The restaurant was one of those places designed to impress, the kind where polished marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers that dripped with crystal, where hushed conversations floated between tables set with white linen and gold-trimmed glasses. It was a temple of wealth, a sanctuary for men like Richard Dane, a ruthless CEO whose fortune had been built not on kindness but on crushing competitors and cutting corners until he stood at the top. He sat there that evening with his wife, Claire, who was visibly pregnant, her delicate hand resting protectively against the curve of her belly. To the staff and other diners, they looked like any power couple, the titan of industry and his elegant, glowing wife. But beneath the veneer of luxury, something darker pulsed. Richard's temper was infamous behind closed doors, a storm that lashed out when control slipped from his grasp. That night, over a dinner meant to showcase his dominance, the mask slipped. A disagreement, small at first, just a whisper of protest from Claire about his cutting remarks, spiraled into something no one at that restaurant could ignore. He leaned across the table, his voice a hiss dripping with contempt, before his hand snapped across her face with a crack that silenced the entire dining room. Gasps rippled through the air as glasses rattled and forks froze midair. Claire's head turned with the blow, her eyes brimming with shock and humiliation, her free hand clutching her stomach as though to shield the child within. The wealthy patrons stared, some horrified, some too cowardly to intervene. And then, from the kitchen beyond the swinging doors, a different kind of silence took hold, a silence filled with the dangerous calm of a man who had heard that sound before, in war zones where cruelty was common and justice was delivered swiftly. For the chef that evening was not just a man in an apron, he was Daniel Mercer, a decorated Navy SEAL, and more importantly, he was Claire's older brother. The moment he realized what had just happened, the air in that restaurant shifted. A predator had entered the room, and his target was the CEO who thought money made him untouchable. The doors to the kitchen swung open with a violent force that made every head in the restaurant turn, the clatter echoing like the opening of a courtroom where judgment was about to be passed. Out stepped Daniel Mercer, apron dusted with flour, his sleeves rolled up, his muscles carved from years of grueling combat training, not culinary school. His eyes, however, were what froze the room, a pair of steel-gray orbs honed by battlefields far beyond the comfort of chandeliers and wine lists. He didn't walk, he stalked, each step deliberate, predatory, the quiet fury of a man who had seen enemies crumble under his gaze. The waitstaff froze, their mouths half open, unsure whether to stop him or simply get out of his way. The diners, wealthy and entitled, instinctively shrank back into their chairs, some fumbling for their phones but too paralyzed by the raw electricity in the air to even lift them. Richard Dane, the CEO, shifted in his seat, his bravado faltering as he registered the recognition in his wife's tearful eyes. "Daniel," Claire whispered, her voice trembling not with fear but with desperate relief. It was enough to confirm every suspicion in Richard's mind, that the man advancing on him wasn't just some employee, but someone with a blood connection to the woman he had just struck. Daniel's jaw tightened, and though his hands were empty, the room vibrated with the sense that violence could erupt in an instant. "Get up," Daniel said, his voice low, controlled, the kind of tone that carried more threat than shouting ever could. Richard scoffed at first, trying to summon his usual arrogance, the mask of power he wore in boardrooms. "This is none of your business," he spat, though his eyes betrayed the tremor of a man suddenly out of his depth. Daniel's lips curled in a grim smile devoid of humor. "You hit her. You made it my business the second you raised your hand." The restaurant's silence deepened, every heartbeat seeming to echo. Claire clutched the tablecloth, torn between fear for her unborn child and awe at the unyielding shield that her brother had become. Richard rose slowly, his expensive suit doing nothing to mask the cowardice leaking through his movements. He tried to meet Daniel's eyes but faltered, for in them he saw not just a brother but a warrior who had survived deserts, jungles, and ambushes, someone who had stared death in the face and learned how to break it. At that moment, every patron in the restaurant understood one truth: this confrontation would not be about money or influence. It would be about justice, raw and unrelenting, delivered by a man who had waited his entire life to protect his sister when she needed him most. Richard Dane tried to summon the confidence that had carried him through hostile takeovers and billion-dollar negotiations, but the boardroom was not this restaurant, and across from him stood not another executive in a tailored suit but a soldier whose body language radiated lethal calm. Daniel closed the gap with the steady inevitability of a storm front, each step measured, each breath controlled, his eyes never leaving the man who had dared to strike his sister. A waiter instinctively moved forward, perhaps to intervene, but froze when Daniel raised a single finger in warning, a silent command that radiated authority stronger than any shouted order. The waiter backed away, as though compelled by forces older than fear itself. Richard's fists clenched, but his knuckles whitened not from courage, but from desperation. "You don't scare me," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the opposite. Daniel leaned in slightly, his face a breath away, his tone so quiet it sliced sharper than a blade. "I'm not here to scare you, Richard. I'm here to remind you what happens when men like you forget there are consequences." The words lingered in the air like smoke. Claire reached out, her hand trembling, whispering Daniel's name as if torn between begging him to stop and needing him to continue. Richard tried to stand taller, but Daniel's presence made him appear smaller, like a child cornered in his own home. Diners whispered nervously, some gripping their wine glasses like lifelines, others discreetly reaching for their phones to capture history unfolding before them. But no device could truly record the tension, the sheer primal charge of the moment. Daniel's fists remained at his sides, yet every fiber of his body was coiled like a panther ready to spring, his breathing steady, his stance unshakable. For the first time in years, Richard realized that money could not buy him protection here, nor would his army of lawyers shield him. In this room, stripped of status, he was just a man who had made the mistake of raising his hand against the wrong woman, under the gaze of the wrong brother. Daniel's voice hardened. "You think because you sign checks and hide behind titles that you can treat her like this? I buried men who were stronger, richer, and crueler than you, Richard. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." The CEO swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a man gulping down fear. His arrogance cracked, his words faltering, but pride, stubborn and blinding, still kept him standing. He spat bitterly, "She's mine. She'll always come back." Daniel's eyes narrowed, and in them glimmered the fury of a soldier who had watched tyrants fall. "No, Richard," he said, each word deliberate and heavy. "She's my sister, and she's done coming back to you." The room seemed to hold its breath as Richard's mask of arrogance shattered into a desperate snarl. Perhaps it was the embarrassment of being exposed before strangers, or perhaps it was the bitter knowledge that Claire's silent tears and Daniel's unyielding stare had cornered him in a place where power no longer answered to him. Whatever it was, Richard exploded with a sudden motion, his hand snapping toward Daniel's chest in a shove meant to reclaim the dominance slipping through his fingers. But what Richard failed to understand was that Daniel had lived a life where hesitation meant death, where every twitch of muscle was a prelude to violence, and every motion could telegraph an enemy's intent. The second Richard moved, Daniel had already shifted, his body flowing with a controlled precision honed in desert firefights and jungle ambushes. In one smooth motion, he caught Richard's wrist midair, twisting it with just enough force to bring the CEO crashing down to his knees before anyone in the restaurant could process what had happened. A cry of pain tore from Richard's throat, raw and unrefined, the sound of a man who had believed himself untouchable suddenly realizing how fragile he truly was. The diners gasped, forks clattering against plates, wine spilling across white tablecloths, but none dared intervene. Daniel held Richard there, pinned in an iron grip, his voice low and deliberate as though he were teaching a lesson meant to be burned into the man's memory. "You thought raising your hand to her proved strength. This," he twisted just enough to elicit another strangled yelp, "is what weakness looks like." Claire's hand flew to her mouth, torn between relief and horror, knowing the brother who had carried her on his shoulders as a child was the same man capable of dismantling another human with a flick of his wrist. Richard's pride thrashed wildly, his face red, sweat beading on his forehead, but Daniel did not let go. His stare was unblinking, unwavering, the stare of a predator that had locked onto its prey. "Look at her," Daniel ordered, forcing Richard's head toward Claire, who sat clutching her stomach protectively. "Look at the woman you swore to protect, not destroy. You don't see a wife. You see property, and that ends tonight." The words cracked like gunfire, and for the first time in his life, Richard Dane, CEO, mogul, empire builder, felt like nothing more than a man stripped bare of all illusions, brought to his knees in a restaurant where every whispered judgment hung heavier than any courtroom verdict.